Hey everybody, welcome to lesson 12. What we're going to take a look at today is working with 3D effects. This is definitely a process that's got a lot more steps, kind of a lot more kind of attention to detail with this. We're going to take a look at a couple different things like working with building some objects, editing them in bulk. So instead of editing one object at a time, we can actually edit multiple things. And then we're going to take a look at playing around with just what 3D looks like, how we can play around with cameras, lighting, effects, that type of thing. So all the start files are available for you in lesson 12 using 3D features. You just click the using 3D or the lesson 12 assets. It's going to pull that right open for you guys. And you're going to see on your desktop or your downloads folder, once you extract it all out, it's going to look something like this. You'll have the start file. So I'm just going to pop that open, and it just opens with this last leaf layer. And then I also have a sky object, and I'm going to drag that in right away and get that set up as well. So first thing I want to do is I want to just first view everything. I'm gonna make this all kind of fit. And I'm actually gonna zoom out a little bit. I think I'm gonna go to maybe around 33% because I'm gonna need to pull pieces off of the back of the artboard. Now, what I wanna do first is drag in my sky layer. And once I have this thing in here, I want this to fit onto my comp. So I'm gonna make sure I go to my layer, and then I wanna fit this thing to comp. Transform, fit to comp, there we go. And I've got this one leaf layer, and what I'm going to essentially need to do is make a bunch of duplicates of this thing and then convert all those pieces into 3D. So what I want to do is I want to start with just selecting this one layer. I'll grab my selection tool and grab the leaf. And here it is. I'm going to start with one, and then I'm just going to make some copies of this thing. So with this thing selected, I can either do edit duplicate. So I can go to my edit menu and just do this duplicate command, or notice that there's a shortcut, this Command D. So I'm going to duplicate it. And with the first one, I'm just going to name it red. So I'm going to press enter and just type in red right away. And then I'm going to duplicate this thing 6 times. So now on this number 6, I'm going to rename this to yellow because I'm going to make different copies of it. So I'll hit enter and type in yellow. And then I'll make 5 copies of that. So let's do that Command D one more time. And before I duplicate it though, I called it yellow. I want to make it yellow. So with the object selected, I'm going to come up here to my fill selection. I'm just going to grab a shade of yellow, and I think that'll be good. And then I'll make my duplications 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then on yellow 6, let's hit enter and let's call this one orange. And if we're going to call it that, let's color it that. So bring it to here. I think that'll probably be good. And we're going to duplicate this thing. So we'll do that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then this one, we're going to call it brown. So you kind of get what we're going with here. We're just going to basically make a bunch of duplicates of these leaves because we're going to try and make them scatter across the screen. So now that that's brown, I'm going to change it kind of like a brownish tone. Something that'll pop on the background a little bit. I think that'll be good. And on that one, we'll do 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So now I've got all these objects, but just like in Photoshop or Illustrator, when you create an object and duplicate it, it just stacks it right on top of itself. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of rearrange these things so it makes a little bit more sense as far as how they're arranged. So now that I can kind of see all these things, what I want to do is I want to pull these off the screen. So if you want, you can even go a little bit further zoomed out, like maybe you want to go to 25%. Basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab all these objects and I'm just going to start stacking them kind of across the top here. And I'm just going to kind of throw them all in. I'm going to try and disperse them so they're kind of even as far as like where they're all located. Now I'm going to grab all my color copies and throw them up here. But there is one leaf that I want to kind of pay close attention to. It's that last leaf. And that one, I want to drag down here. I want to kind of pull that off because we're going to use that as part of the logo for this kind of final animation. The idea is that we're basically making like a production company animation. So we're going to have all these leaves kind of drift in. And then once they're all kind of in place, then we'll kind of play around with our positioning. And I'm going to grab some off to the side a little bit. I just want to make sure that if I have a piece that I'm not seeing any of it on the artboard. Maybe I'll grab a couple over here too and kind of arrange it around there. All right, so now I got my last leaf down on the bottom, and what I want to do is I want to select all these things and turn them into a 3-dimensional piece. So what I'm going to do is on my timeline down here, I'm going to select that first red. I'm going to leave the last leaf alone. We're going to kind of come back to that one a little bit later. And I'm gonna scroll all the way up to the top one, and I'm gonna shift click so that they're all selected. Now remember, we got this little like 3D object option here. So if I would click on one, what it does is it just automatically creates like all of them selected. You might get a warning saying something about how you've created a 3D bin. That's fine, because basically what happened is now all those objects that you have are all selected as 3D. And you'll see that there's these little kind of like widget things that show up around it. And that's ways that you can manually control the X, Y, and Z dimensions on all the objects. So now that I got all these things selected in, as a bin, what I want to do is I want to take a look at some of my options of how I can make these things like move. I kind of want to make it look like they're like fluttering onto the screen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press my P button so I can see my position. I'll hold my Shift button and then press S and then Shift R. So it's going to reveal all these different properties. Now, because I have them all selected, if I change it on one, it's just going to change it on all of them right away. So I'll just scroll all the way up to the top one, but it doesn't matter which one you select. It's going to apply it to the same on all of them. Now, I want to make sure that my time indicator here, that I'm scrubbed to the very beginning. And I'm going to click my stopwatch on the position, orientation, and rotation. So position, orientation, and notice my rotation, because we're 3D objects now, it rotates on an X, Y, and Z axis. So I want to make sure I have all those selected as well. So now this is my first kind of keyframe. This is my starting point, right? Now, with them all selected, what I want to do is I want to get them to kind of shift down in size a little bit. So I'm going to start with my scale, and notice that this isn't a tween. I'm just going to make these things smaller. So now I'll set this to 33%. And now notice it kind of grabs all of them. What I can do though is if I select all these objects, they kind of grab them and pull them into different kind of areas. If you want, you can kind of grab them and move them over a little bit and kind of reposition them so that they kind of flutter in. I think that looks good. I just wanted to make sure that I don't have my sky or my last leaf selected. I just want to select all the other ones. So those are all good. And this is kind of my start point. So what I want to do is I want to jump forward to the 1 second and 20 frame mark. So right about here. And now I want to start changing stuff. So I'm going to change my X, my Y, and my Z rotation. Notice that there's this little X. This is how many times it spins. So I'm going to change this to 2 for X, Y, and Z. I'll just hit tab when I'm done. So it kind of goes to the next field. So now they should all rotate 2 times between the start and the finish points. Now it's going to change that on all of these. So if it's not changing on yours, make sure you have a shift click so that they're all selected. You'll know that they're all selected because you're going to see that 3D widget kind of wrapped around all of them. Now, if I want to hide all of these properties, I can press U and it'll hide. Oop. And I can also just hit collapse and it'll collapse on all of them, so I don't have to see all this. Now, what I want to do is I want to start dragging these things and pulling them down onto the frame. So I'm at the 1 second and 20 frame. So what it should mean is that at my start point here, and you can see they're kind of like rotating up here. So now at this point, I want to start moving these things. I want to start adjusting the position of them. So I'm going to grab a leaf and I'm going to drag them all into the frame so they kind of position out to different points. Now I have them all selected. I don't want them all selected, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click away. And now I can grab them one at a time. Start kind of pulling them down to where I want them to go. And I'm just going to kind of randomly grab them and throw them onto the frame. I'm just going to try and fill this as much as possible. They're all going to move uniformly. They're all going to kind of have the same rotation, but based on the direction they go or how far they go, the direction they're coming from, that'll adjust kind of that float. Now, in order to do like really solid looking animation, generally your best bet is to take everything and kind of manually adjust it one at a time. And I stretched instead of grabbing. I want to make sure I'm inside that area. I'm going to show you guys the steps on how to kind of update one of them. I'm not going to, for the sake of time, make you watch me update 20 leaves individually, but just so you can kind of get the idea. And I'm just kind of grabbing them all. So now the idea is that these things are just kind of fluttering into the frame. You're going to see that your rendering is probably going to look a little funky, but here they're like floating and drifting, and they're all kind of working at the same point, right? Now, I have all those kind of in position, and they kind of have some of that room. Now, if I notice that some of them, like maybe they're not just going far enough, if you grab your piece, so say like I grab this leaf and I just stretch it down further, you may see a little bit more flow with them. So some of that might get hidden up here. If you drag it a little further down, you can kind of adjust that. Now I'm gonna go to the 2-second and 10 frame mark. And at this point, I'm gonna select all the leaves and I'm gonna do one more effect with them. So now I'm gonna go all the way up to the top and I'm gonna hold my shift key and select all the way down to red. So all of them except for the last leaf in the sky. I'm not gonna mess with that. Now at this point, what I wanna do is I want them to kind of all fall off the bottom as a group. So they're gonna flutter in a frame, land in a position, and then flutter down, or just pull straight down. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna press my P button so I can see my position. And for my Y, so I've got my X and my Y, I'm just gonna drag this and just start scrubbing it to the right until they're all the way off the board. Just like that. I think that looks good. Now, at any point, I can always jump back and see your machine may run slow with this because now you've got a bunch of 3D objects, like 20 of them, that are all essentially requiring a render. So I've noticed that on mine, like the playback was just kind of slow, but I do want to kind of scrub and see what's going to happen. So let's see if I play it back. I think it looks pretty good. They're all a little too uniform, but the idea is there. So let me stop that and jump back into my 2-second and 10 frame mark. And I think that looks good. It's going where I want to. So I think what I want to do is I want to start kind of playing around with maybe adjusting a little bit of this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to that 1-second and 20 frame mark here. And here, I want to just kind of customize these things. So instead of doing them all the same, you can maybe adjust a handful of them, or maybe you want to grab these like 2, 3 at a time. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to play around with my rotation. So they're all still selected. I'm going to do that Shift R so I can see my rotation. And here I'm going to start adding some additional rotational pieces to it. So maybe like on my X, and I'm just going to type this in because this is kind of slow for all of them. I'll go to like 15 degrees. For my Y, let's set that like maybe something more extreme, like 300 degrees. Z, I'll set that to 325. Ooh, I want to make sure I'm in the right field because I was going to make 325 rotations, which would have been way too much. Should have degrees. There we go. Now they're going to do a little bit more fluttering as they go. Now, if you want yours to look individually different, that's where you're going to deselect all this. And you're just going to select one object at a time and kind of play with these numbers. So if you wanted to do less or more, then you can kind of start going in one object at a time and then fine tuning it. So I'm just going to do the first couple. I'll just do some of these brown ones. So now if I go back to the beginning, scrub back and hit play. So just kind of floating through and then falling off the screen. Now again, you guys can grab different chunks of leaves and kind of adjust them as you see fit. I'm not going to make you kind of sit through and watch that, but you'll get the idea is that as you adjust these one at a time on that keyframe, that's where you're going to see those options kind of come in and adjust in. So now we got all that taken care of. What I want to do is I want to start taking a look at adding some lighting onto this scene. So right now we just have this kind of image. What I want to do is basically kind of color grade the whole thing so that it applies like a wash across it. So what we're going to do is we're going to add in some lights. First one I'm going to do is add in an ambient light. So I'm going to deselect everything and I'm going to jump back to my beginning point at 0 seconds. And I'm going to go up to my layer menu and then new. And notice we got another thing we haven't really looked at yet, this new light. So on this new light, I'm going to add in an ambient light. I'm going to call this a fall light. And for my color, I'll just make this like a light yellow. For my intensity, I'm going to bump that all the way up to 100. Now, I can't see anything with this yet because I didn't apply it, and also it's not a 3D object. So what I want to do is, let me select all my objects here and collapse everything. And let's do this. Let's make that 3D light an object. And now you can see when that 3D light becomes an object, the color now applies to it. So if it's not, that 3D isn't in there, it's not an object, or the sky background isn't an object in 3 dimensions, the fall light doesn't apply to it. The lighting will only apply to areas that have 3-dimensional settings on them. So that looks good. And I think the other thing I want to do is with this sky layer, I want to fade this out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go just with my sky layer. Select that. I'm going to go in and I'm going to press my T button so I can see my opacity settings, and I'm going to make a keyframe of 100, and I'm going to fade this guy out. So by the time that this thing gets to 2 seconds, all the leaves are kind of falling off the screen. So at that 2-second mark, I'm going to have this fade out so that we'll fade this to black. And every time this happens, it does require a re-render, so everything kind of flutters in. At 2-second mark, background fades to black, and then that's going to give me an idea of how I can put all of that, stuff in one bin or one object, and then bring in my featured area, which is going to be this logo, this little leaf, that last leaf, and we're going to add in some text here. So what I want to do is I want to select all my layers except for my lights. So I'm going to shift click from the very bottom sky all the way up, but I'm going to deselect that last leaf. I'm going to hold my command key and click on last leaf. I don't want that in there, but I want my sky background and all my leaves. I want to put them in one big kind of bin. So if I right click on this, I can do pre-compose, and I can just call this leaves. And what this is going to do is this is basically just going to make that all into one comp. So now all that stuff that I just did is all kind of locked into one area. And the other thing I want to do is I just want this stuff to kind of disappear. So under my comp settings, I can actually set comp settings for individual pre-composed layers. So for this little bin, right now it's at 4 seconds. I want to make this thing a little bit short. I'll do 2 seconds and 15 frames. So now my leaves is actually going to be shorter when it gets to the bottom here. It all disappears and then just kind of cuts off, right? So what I'm going to do is close this, jump back into my main comp, and now when I play this back, the leaf shrinks. Here it all happens. It all fades out. It all flutters away. And then that's kind of cleaning up my timeline. So now I don't have to see all this stuff. Now I can just see my last leaf, my lighting, my ambient setting that I turned on there, and then how it's applying everywhere else. All right, now we got that all taken care of. Next thing I want to do is I want to start taking a look at adding in the final pieces so that we can put them into a 3-dimensional space and kind of animate them. I'm going to scrub all the way to the last frame, and we're zoomed out, so I think I'm okay on that. But what I want to do is I want to add in some text layers. So I'm going to add in 3 separate text layers, and I also want to grab this leaf, and let's get this thing on the screen. Now, when you slide your leaf up, remember we're in a 3-dimensional space now. We have this z-axis. We can make things get bigger or smaller. So keep in mind that if your stuff ever disappears, like say I'm here and I can't see it, it may be that it's hidden behind another object. So you can play around with that depth or the amount of space in that 3-dimensional space. And we're going to see a 3D camera view in just a second. But I just want to make sure that if you slide yours on up end of the screen, you don't see it, that you know you can hit the Z scrubber and pull it forward so it's an actual like visible space. All right, so now for my text insert, I'm going to type in red. I'm just going to go a little bit bigger with this. You guys can grab it whatever font you want. I just kind of use like the default or whatever was on there. I'm going to set 3 different points. I'm going to grab this thing, I'm going to slide it over here, and I'm going to kind of do like a little triangle effect. So I'll do 1 there. Leaf. Let me move this into position. And I want to make sure that my color is just the same as here. So if I'm grabbing this, I can just select this, or if I just want to use my sample tool and make sure it's the exact shade as that one, I can do that as well. Grab my point tool and grab my last piece of text. And I'm going to slide this right about here. I think looks good. Once I have these in place, what I also want to do is I want to kind of change my positioning of this. So like on this red text, let's hit your R button. Let's rotate this. I think we're going to go button -45 degrees. So it kind of hugs along here. Grab my leaf and hit my R button so I can rotate this one. Let's go 45 degrees the other direction. Snug that up. I think that looks good. And now I'm going to grab all this stuff and just kind of center it on the screen a little bit more. I think that looks good. All right, so now that all these objects are built, the next thing we need to do is take a look at making them 3D objects. So I'm going to shift click on all these, and if I collapse these, I can kind of see everything. That's already a 3D object. Let's grab a red leaf in media, and let's make sure that that's got 3D turned on as well. So now they'll work with that widget. And I want to take a look at all the properties for all of these things. I want to make all these things kind of act and look the same way. So I'm going to shift click on all of them. So again, I can hold shift and click on the top to bottom. And I want to expand out all the properties. So if I expand this on one, it just kind of expands it on all. So what we're going to take a look at on this is we're going to take a look at some of the geometry options. We'll also take a look at material options. So geometry options are going to be how this thing kind of acts in a three-dimensional space. So right now there's no bevel. I'm going to turn on a bevel, and because I have it selected on one, it should do it on all of them. So I'll make it concave. For my bevel depth and bevel hole depth, I'll leave with my extrusion. Extrusion is kind of the thickness of an object. I want to put some thickness on this. So I'm going to turn it up to 50. You're probably going to see like a real slight kind of bump out. I don't want this thing to be like super thick, but I want to add like a thickness to this, and that's what that extrusion depth is going to do. So if I hide all my options here and I click away, you'll see now kind of a little bit of a thickness to these things. Now we're not fully in a 3D space yet, so when we get in there and we start adding different lighting effects, you'll see that a little bit more clearly. So we have objects, we have a 3D to them. Let's see these things in a 3D space. If you take a look down on the bottom right of your preview window, you've got all these different kind of cameras and you've got these different views. Because I'm in a 3D space, I'm going to go to this 4 view, and now you're going to see this thing as kind of a couple different objects. Now here on active camera, I can kind of take a look, like custom views, front, left, top, right, bottom. I can kind of take a look at all the different views to see the front, the back, the angle. And as far as kind of like my spacing, I do have some different camera options that I can kind of play around with now. So I've got these camera tools. I've got an orbit, a pan, a dolly, and those things are all hidden up here. So here's my different orbit kind of directionals. So now if I take that view and maybe I'll go to my active camera, now when I rotate these and click, now I can see that depth. So as you're playing around with it, those are just different options. Here's your dolly, here's your pan. So these are just kind of different ways to view through your three-dimensional object. But right now what I want to do is I just want to do a 2 view. And on my left side, I can tell I have it selected because I've got these little blue dots. I'm going to click on that. And on my left side, I'll view the right view. And then on this side, I want to do the front view. So I can kind of see where they are in three-dimensional space. It looks like my text is in front of my leaf in the background, and it's kind of showing me that by these objects. Now, I got a three-dimensional space, and rather than move these objects individually, what we can do is set up a camera and make the camera pan around the scene. So it's a little bit smarter way of working so that we don't have to adjust 4 things, we just have to adjust 1. So what I'm going to do is make sure all my layers are deselected, and I'm going to go up to my layer menu and then do new and add in a new camera. It should default you to a 20mm camera. I don't need to name it or anything, but I'm going to use this 20mm. There's all different sizes, and that just kind of controls the lens views. I'm going to click OK, and now I can see here's my camera, and here's how it's going to view this area. My camera is now added as an object in my timeline. So with that on there, now I can kind of make some adjustments to how it looks. So here, like maybe on this right side, let's go to active camera for my view. And now it's seeing how that three-dimensional kind of object looks with these settings. And you're going to notice on this left side here, let me zoom out a little bit more. Zoom in on this one. Make sure I got my rates. Here's kind of the camera, and here's how the camera is viewing the scene. It's just seeing it straight on. So on my active camera, let's zoom back in. Let's get to about 33%. Come on, a little bit closer view. Now it's going to show me how kind of my controlling is going to work for this camera. Now, I got the camera built, and what I want to do is make that camera do something now, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that I'm at the end of my view. So at the end of the time ruler, 3 seconds and 23 frames. I'm going to select that camera 1, and I'm going to hit my P button so I can see the position. And I'm going to create a first keyframe by just checking this box. I want it to end here, okay? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go backwards. I'm going to kind of make the position of the camera shift from a different point in the animation. So like kind of like right here where like these leaves are, this is where I want the camera to kind of start moving and swooping in. So I'm going to change my position values to, and I'm going to kind of pull them far out. Negative 2000, 2000, negative 2000. Now you can see my camera pulled way out, shifted way out, and here it's like now we can kind of see it, but now we're controlling that camera. So we can see that this camera is going to kind of follow that shift or that path along this line. And if I wanted to, I can even put like a little bit of a curve on how the camera swoops around. So now if I play it forward, hit my space bar, as the leaves are kind of disappearing, now my camera is swinging in on those three-dimensional objects we built. And obviously it's rendering a little bit slower because it's got kind of a lot to process here. And now it's kind of doing this like big dramatic swoop in with that little curve we added. I'm not super happy with kind of how it looks, but I think it's getting me where I want to be. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go all the way to the end here, and I'm going to ease this animation in. I'm going to right click on this keyframe, and there's this keyframe assistant. I'm going to do easy ease in. And I can do that on both of these. So that'll kind of give me a smoother start point to my animation, how it starts and how it ends. So now that we've got the animation happening, all we need to do is kind of add in some lighting to this thing and add in a little bit of more like in terms of like material properties, shadowing, kind of how that all looks. So what we want to do first is we want to add a spotlight. So on this last frame, we're going to do one more of those new lights. So I'm on my last frame. I see my logo. I'll go up to my layer menu and do a new light. Now, for this one, I want a new spotlight. So for this, what I'll do is just call it spotlight. On my lighting type, notice that there's spot is one of them. And then for my color, I'm going to do like a white, just kind of like a little bit brighter. And then for my intensity, I'll set it at 100, cone angle 90 is good, feathering is 50, that's kind of how it blends off. I think that's good. For fall off, I'm going to leave that at none, but I do want to make sure that my object casts shadows against backgrounds and other elements. So I'm going to click OK. And now it shows me this cone, and this cone has three-dimensional properties. And I'm also seeing it here as far as kind of how my light's going to look. I can control where it lights from here, or I can use these objects as well. So if I want to rotate or adjust my light, I'm pretty good with it though. I think I just want it spotted right on the main object. But what I want to do is I want to do a fill light. I want to do kind of a secondary light to kind of light in that edge a little bit more. So now what I'll do is again make another light. So I'll go to layer, new, and then lights. This is going to be a fill. And for my color, I'm going to make this kind of a light blue. Something kind of subtle. And because this is an ambient, I want to change that because it's going to fill the rest of the area. For my intensity, I'm going to knock it down a little bit. I want to go 65%. And I'll click OK. And then that just kind of fills out the back end. So now we're starting to see a little bit more of kind of the depth of the object. And as it kind of comes through, because we've created this here, those lights are going to follow the camera, and it's going to kind of expose a little bit more and kind of reveal a little bit more of the depth of the object. So you can use that lighting to kind of create a little bit more of an exaggerated three-dimensional effect. So last thing that I want to take a look at is kind of playing around with some of these material properties of what we're looking at for our pieces. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all my leaf layers and all my different parts of my logo. So I've got my media leaf, last leaf. I'm going to shift click on all these things. I'm going to press my 8 key twice, because then it's going to give me my material options. And I want to change this couple of these options here. I want to make sure that cast shadows is turned on. I want to make sure that these kind of cast onto each other as they interact through the lighting. And then I'm going to change some of my material options here. See, I've got all these kind of different like light, intensity, if it's metal, how much it reflects, all that kind of stuff. My specular intensity, I'm going to bump that up. I'm going to set that to 35. Give us a little bit more of an intense kind of look. And then for the shininess, it's at 5. I want this to be a little bit more shiny. I want it to reflect a little bit more light. So that'll kind of bump that up a little bit as well. So now as it scrubs through, it's just going to kind of adjust how that acts. So now that I'm done, I'm going to go back in and kind of collapse all my different properties. I want to do one last preview of this thing before I export it out as an MP4. And hopefully deselect everything so that I don't see any of these options. And for my views, I'll go back to one view. I'm just going to do my main camera view, and I'll hit my playback button and see what happens here. Now it's playing back really slow on the first render. This may happen with yours. You've got a lot of stuff happening here. What you'll be looking for is once it plays back through once and fully renders out with that green bar, then you can kind of play it back a second time and see. Now, because our camera was so far out, it's kind of slowly pulling in and getting a little bit more as it gets kind of closer to it. It almost feels like it picks up speed a little bit. Now it's pulling in. My camera's working right in my three-dimensional space. Now we're going to take a look at some additional 3D options of how we can like 3D map in environments, but I think this is like a great starting point. So if you ever want to kind of like play around with that idea of 3 dimensions, this works great with text, but it also is a fun way to kind of pull in on an object. Now, if I wanted to, I could maybe go in and do like an opacity blur. So instead of this kind of showing up that maybe my opacity slowly kicks in on these layers, you know, there's some other options you can do. But again, now you got a basic idea of working with cameras and lights and kind of how you can use that to affect the rest of your objects. So when you're done with this thing, you're going to save this off as an MP4 file and email it to me. And then the next lesson we'll be taking a look at is, now that we've seen kind of working with 3D views, we'll take a look at 3D camera tracking, which is really cool. You can take any footage, assign points to it, and then make the camera kind of swoop around in terms of adding in additional elements and making them interact with it in real time. So it's a really cool effect. It'll be something that you'll be using for your final project. So that's what I got for you guys. Good luck with it, have fun, and I'll see you next time.